If one day you left home with a heart full of scars, and the only thing giving you hope vanished, the moment you stepped onto new soil would you stand firm, or would you fall? Out on the frontier, where the wind wears down old wooden signs, and silence settles deep into the earth, Eliza Morrow, the mail-order bride with a long scar tracing her cheek, arrives at Hartwell Ridge, carrying nothing but a fragile dream of starting over. But the man who promised to marry her, Caleb Hartwell, is gone, vanished. All that remains is an abandoned house, a field half burned to ash, and a sky so wide it makes a woman who's lost everything feel even smaller. In that moment, when fate seems to turn its back on her, Eliza faces a cruel choice: return to a past full of pity and closed doors, or stay in a land that never asked for her, never promised her anything. And then a man appears through the storm. Archer Hartwell, Caleb's twin brother, returns home and finds himself standing before the woman his brother should have welcomed. His gaze doesn't flinch from Eliza's scar, nor does it pity her. It sees her, her losses, and beneath his calm she glimpses the quiet fractures he carries too. If it were you standing before an empty house, and a man who looks exactly like the groom you were meant to marry, yet carries a completely different heart, would you stay, or would you walk away? Welcome to a story of kindness, honor, and love. Rising from the ashes, where two souls, strangers on paper, discover each other in the dusty winds of Wind Creek Flats. If you cherish tales of healing and second chances, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This journey is just beginning. The train rolled slowly across the thin layer of early winter snow, its iron wheels grinding against the tracks with a sound as mournful as the east's long-tired exhale. Inside the old wooden carriage, where the flicker of an oil lamp cast pale yellow streaks against the walls, Eliza Morrow sat quietly beside a fogged-up window. Her fingers clutched a worn brown hat, as if it were the only thing keeping her from slipping into the emptiness that had pulled at her ever since that fateful day. On her right cheek, the long scar, the mark left by the fire, flushed red whenever the cold wind seeped into the cabin. She tilted her head slightly, letting the hat brim hide the disfigured skin, though no one in the compartment seemed to pay attention to a solitary woman like her. Wind slipped through the cracks, carrying with it the scent of coal smoke and damp timber scents that reminded her of street. Alden, the town where she had lost both her parents and the future she once believed was certain. That autumn night's fire had turned her family home to ash in minutes. Her parents were trapped in the collapse, and Eliza survived only to everyone's astonishment, but the price of survival was the scar down her cheek and a heart forever altered. Weeks later, when she tried returning to the school with hopes of resuming her work as a teacher, the job she had considered her calling, the school board looked at her with pity rather than compassion. An elderly professor who had known her family for years could only murmur, "Children can be cruel, Eliza. You should take some time off." The words were like a second cut, colder than the wound, still knitting itself across her face. Without a job, without a home, without family, Eliza moved in temporarily with a distant aunt, a place where she always felt like an uninvited guest. The silent dinners, the stiff reminders that a young woman alone must know her place, only deepened her sense that her former life had shut its doors for good and nowhere was left untouched enough for her to return to. It was in those dark weeks that a letter from the far west arrived. The letter was from Jonas Hartwell, a man Eliza had never met, living in Wind Creek Flats, a land of red earth stretching to the horizon. His handwriting wasn't elegant, but it was honest. "I can't promise riches. All I have is a piece of land and a house that needs tending. If you want somewhere to start over, Wind Creek still has room for folks to build a new life." No sweet words, no poetic lines like the courtship letters she'd received in the past. Only the sincerity of a man who knew work, who knew what it meant to stand back up after harsh winters, and perhaps understood the kind of loneliness that tightens the chest. Eliza read the letter over and over each night. In every line she glimpsed the life she longed for, a place where no one stared at her out of pity, a place where people cared only about what she could do, not what she had lost. One early morning, as the first light streamed through the window of the room where she was staying, Eliza folded the letter, placed it in her suitcase, and knew her decision was made. She would leave not to run away but to seek. To seek a land that could accept her scars, a home that would not judge her, a life where the past's pain was no longer an anchor holding her down. On that rocking train, memories of street Alden drifted through her mind like thin smoke, but in her heart, a small seed of hope dared to push upward. She whispered to herself, if Wind Creek Flats isn't meant for me, maybe nowhere is. It wasn't despair, it was the quiet prayer of someone who had lost almost everything, yet held on to the last thread of dignity. And that silent resolve was what made Eliza's story resonate with anyone who had ever stood at an unwanted crossroads, beginning again with nothing left to lose, except what could never be taken. The train pushed onward toward the west, the falling dusk spreading over the distant plains like a thin blanket laid by the Lord himself. Eliza watched the sky widen a little more with every mile the train advanced. Older folks watching her story, those who had lived through war, failed harvests, and losses too hard to name, would understand the quiet heartbeat of a woman brave enough to leave her past behind just to protect a flicker of hope. And in that moment, Eliza, the woman scarred yet steadfast, began to breathe in the rhythm of the western frontier, slow, enduring, patient, a beginning without fanfare, but powerful enough to linger in the hearts of those who hear it. And when the train finally jolted to a stop in that vast open stretch of land, where the wind couldn't be bothered to change direction, and the sun sank so slowly it seemed determined to hold the world inside a perpetual dusk, Eliza stepped down, without knowing that the first thing waiting for her was absence. Wind Creek Junction was much smaller than she had imagined. It stood alone beneath a naked sky, no shelter but a faded wooden awning and a few peeling signboards. The wind blew through the warped planks, making them tremble like the tired sighs of a land too sparsely lived in. No bustle, no reunions, only wind and dust. Eliza stood there, gripping the handle of her suitcase, as though it were her last scrap of resolve. She scanned the empty platform, hoping to spot the man who had written those simple, earnest letters, the man she believed would at least offer a polite smile when he met her. But no one with the name Hartwell was there. No one seemed to be waiting for anyone at all. The train pulled away after a few minutes, leaving Eliza in a silence so long she could hear her own heartbeat beneath her heavy coat. A station hand passed by, glanced at her, then bent to retie his boot without a word. A woman with a headscarf hurried past, carrying a child, turning her face away, as if stopping to acknowledge a stranger cost more than she could spare. Eliza waited a few minutes, then a few dozen more. The last light of day stretched across the station roof in pale gold ribbons, but the road to what she had hoped would be Jonas Hartwell's home remained unclaimed. Just when Eliza began to wonder if she had gotten off at the wrong stop, a small voice rose behind her. "Mom, are you looking for someone?" A paperboy, thin as a reed, clutching a stack of unsold newspapers. His face was dusted with the road's grit, his dark eyes sharp and cautious in that way. Frontier children often were kids who grew up with less but understood more. Eliza bent down, trying to offer a steady smile. "I'm waiting for Mr. Jonas Hartwell. He promised he would come for me." The boy pressed his lips together as if weighing whether he should say what he knew. Then he spoke softly but clearly. "The Hartwell place. His ranch got struck by lightning. Burned part of it down. Mr. Jonas, he's gone now, ma'am." The words weren't loud, but they sliced clean through Eliza's chest. It felt as if the weight of the long journey, the weight of old wounds, and the hope she had carried all this way, all of it collapsed into one crushing point that almost made her knees buckle. Gone now, a phrase the West used for those who left with no promise of return. Maybe he'd gone to another state. Maybe he'd joined a mining crew. Maybe he'd gone someplace from which no one comes back. Eliza steadied her voice. "No one knows where he went." The boy shook his head. "Folks say he packed up and left Wind Creek 2 weeks ago. Didn't leave nothing. Didn't tell nobody." A sharp wind cut across the platform, lifting the corner of Eliza's coat, as if trying to reveal the tremor running through her. But she stayed upright, eyes fixed on the line of gray-purple mountains where the sun was sinking behind the ridge. In that moment she understood one plain, merciless truth: Jonas Hartwell wasn't coming, and likely never would. She was a stranger in a strange land with a marriage that might have been abandoned before it even began. A coldness crept down her spine, not the cold of the wind but the cold of sudden isolation, the kind that comes when you realize there's no road left to turn back to. Eliza drew a slow breath, nodded gratefully to the boy, and stepped beneath the station's sagging awning. She set down her suitcase, took a seat on the wobbling bench, and instinctively tugged the brim of her hat over her scar. Not because she feared being seen, but because she needed to shield the last fragment of pride she still possessed. What now? Return to Street Alden? No. Returning meant facing the pitying looks, the whispered, "We told you so," the truth, that she had gambled her life on a fragile hope, and that hope had vanished before she even arrived. All she had left was this patch of earth and the silence of Wind Creek, waiting to see whether Eliza would rise or collapse. Older listeners would recognize the ache instantly, the sting of reaching for a new beginning, only to be dropped at its threshold. Not a grand tragedy, but the quiet disappointment that every life meets at least once. Eliza rose again, slower this time, steadier. She turned back to the boy. "Do you know anyone here who might have known Mr. Jonas?" He thought for a moment. "If anybody does, it be the Callahans at the general store. They know near everything that happens in this town." Eliza thanked him gently. She looked toward the red dirt road leading into the town, where oil lamps were beginning to flicker to life like cautious invitations. No one had come for her, but the road was open, and for now that was enough for her to keep walking. The red dirt road leading Eliza away from the barren station felt as if it had been built solely to test the hearts of newcomers. Night wind slipped through the low roofs of the town, carrying the scent of coal fires, warming the last of the evening. Oil lamps hung in front of small shops, their soft flicker glowing like gentle eyes watching a traveler step hesitantly into frontier life. Eliza pulled her heavy suitcase along with breaths that grew shorter each step. Her legs were tired, but her spirit was more exhausted still. All along the walk, the paperboy's words drifted after her like a whisper in the wind. "Mr. Jonas." "He's gone now, ma'am." A muted disappointment tightened around her chest. Not because she loved Jonas, they had never met, but because the fragile hope she had carried across her long journey had dissolved into the dust with those few simple words. Yet when she saw the amber light spilling warmly from the windows of the town's general store, something else stirred inside her, something she didn't yet dare to name. A wooden sign hung above the door, "Callahan General Store, since '72. The wood had faded, the paint had peeled, but the door stood open as if it rarely knew the feel of a lock. Eliza hesitated for a moment before pushing it. A crisp jingle of wind chimes sounded, and in that instant, a small weight lifted from her shoulders. A woman in her 50s, full-figured, kind, faced with warm brown eyes like autumn soil, stepped out from behind the counter. Maeve Callahan looked at Eliza, not with the caution common in frontier towns, but with the expression of someone who recognized the weariness in a stranger before the stranger even spoke. "Out walking in this cold, dear?" Maeve asked, her voice carrying the warmth of a hearth fire. Eliza managed only a faint nod. Maeve didn't pry or hesitate. She touched Eliza's elbow gently and guided her inside. "Sit here, darling. Let me make you some tea." Her voice was slow, steady, a rhythm Eliza's heart hadn't felt in weeks, the simple comfort of not being alone. Elliot Callahan, Maeve's husband, stepped in from the storeroom. A thin man, shoulders slightly bent from years of labor. When Eliza mentioned Jonas Hartwell, he exchanged a glance with his wife, then nodded and gestured for Eliza to sit. He took the letter from her trembling hands and studied the handwriting carefully. After a long moment, Elliot exhaled softly. "Yes, that's Jonas's hand. But he left Wind Creek 2 weeks ago. No one knows why." There was no blame in his tone, no judgment, just the gentle truth of an older man speaking a sad fact with the softness of evening mist. Eliza lowered her head, fingers clutching the hem of her skirt. The scar along her right cheek warmed as though shame had reached out to touch it once more. Sometimes hurt didn't come from someone causing pain, it came from realizing there was no one standing on your side. Maeve watched all of this quietly. Then, with the sensitivity of a woman who had lived through many winters, she set a steaming cup of tea in Eliza's hands, her touch steadying the girl's ice-cold fingers. "Eliza, isn't it?" The gentle way Maeve spoke her name startled her. Not many people said her name kindly the first time they met. Maeve smiled, her eyes pausing briefly on Eliza's scar. But what surprised Eliza was what she didn't see. No pity, no discomfort. Only respect, soft and earnest like the smell of warm bread in a winter kitchen. And then Maeve said, her voice low and steady like a nighttime prayer. In this land, child, a scar only means you survived something others couldn't. Eliza lifted her gaze. Just that one sentence and half the weight she'd carried seemed to fall away. It was a simple truth of the West. People were judged not by what storms had torn from them but by their ability to rise afterward. Older listeners would understand immediately. It was a familiar reminder. A person's true worth lies not in how they appear but in what they've endured to still be here, breathing, living, hoping for a place to call home. Elliot pulled a wooden chair closer to the table, inviting Eliza to sit more comfortably. Wind Creek's not such a bad place, he said. Thing is, it tests newcomers a bit, but if you've come this far you must have had your reasons. That simple line showed Eliza what kindness meant in Wind Creek. It didn't parade itself. It came softly, patiently through small gestures, a warm cup of tea, a sentence that didn't wound. Eliza spoke, halting at first but honest about her journey, her losses, and Jonas's letter, not to complain, but because she sensed these were the first people here who saw her standing upright, not as a woman abandoned at the threshold of a new life. Maeve listened with a deep, thoughtful silence, the kind only those who've lived many seasons possess. When Eliza finished, Maeve laid her hand over hers, gentle but firm. You're not alone, sweetheart. In Wind Creek, everyone leans on someone their first day. It wasn't a promise, it was simply how frontier life worked. The tea in Eliza's cup had cooled, but her heart had warmed in a way she hadn't believed possible anymore. In a life threaded with losses, sometimes all it took was one person saying, "I understand," for another's spirit to stand strong for one more day. The door of the Callahan store had barely finished swinging shut behind Maeve's gentle reassurances when it burst open again. A rush of icy wind swept in, carrying the damp breath of an unexpected early-season rain. And standing in the doorway, framed against the slate-gray sky sliding down over Wind Creek's narrow street, was a tall silhouette, as if the land itself had summoned him home at the exact moment he was needed. The man stood motionless for a long beat before stepping fully inside. His heavy canvas coat was soaked through his boots, caked with red mud. But what drew Eliza's attention was his face, a harder, colder, more weather-worn version of the man who had written to her. His gray-blue eyes carried none of the hesitance or shy warmth she remembered from Jonas's letters. These eyes had been sharpened by years of wind and grit. They observed everything without judgment, simply taking it in the gaze of someone who had learned to confront the truth head-on, leaving nothing unnoticed. Maeve Callahan broke the thickening silence. Archer, Hartwell. It really is you. 3 years gone, and not a single letter. The man dipped his head in greeting, his voice low and rough, threaded with exhaustion, and something tightly held. I came back like I said I would, Mrs. Maeve. Eliza's breath caught. Archer Hartwell. Hartwell, Jonas's last name. She had barely begun piecing the fragments together when Archer saw her. His steely gaze paused on her face, following the long scar along her right cheek, not recoiling, not pitying. Just seeing. As if he were reading a story most people didn't have the patience to open. That look unsettled Eliza, but not in a painful way. It reminded her that some people didn't fear the truth, even when the truth left marks on a person's face, or deeper still in their heart. Elliot spoke up, setting Jonas's letter onto the table. Archer, there's something here, something you ought to know. Archer stepped closer, his broad shoulders slightly drawn inward, the posture of a man who carried more burdens than he ever spoke of. He glanced at the letter, then at Eliza, and in that glance she felt the moment he began to understand. Maeve explained softly, "This young woman is Eliza Morrow. She came all the way from Street, Alden, because of Jonas's marriage letter." The air inside the store seemed to tighten. Archer didn't answer at once. He stared down at the letter as though searching for some mistake. But the handwriting was unmistakable, Jonas's handwriting, the handwriting of his twin brother, the one he knew better than anyone alive. When Archer finally lifted his head, Eliza saw a flicker of shock, a rare, unguarded emotion breaking through a face too practiced in restraint. Jonas was engaged, his voice was low, almost disbelieving, as if each word carried the weight of years left unspoken. Maeve nodded gently. She came to start a new life with Jonas. But she arrived too late. Jonas left Wind Creek 2 weeks ago. Archer stepped back half a pace, his hand curling slightly, the reflex of a man who had just lost something he hadn't even realized he could lose. For a brief moment, he no longer looked like the seasoned traveler dripping rainwater onto the wooden floor. He looked like a brother trying to swallow the truth that his family had changed without waiting for him. Eliza lowered her gaze. She didn't want her eyes to meet the hurt crossing Archer's face, not out of discomfort but out of understanding. She knew what it felt like to stand outside the lives of those she once trusted. Elliot cleared his throat, his voice rough but kind. Archer, you know Jonas. He lives on impulse. Doesn't always tell anyone what he's planning. Archer didn't argue, but something shifted behind his eyes, memories being rearranged, clicking into place, with the new truth laid before him. He turned to Eliza. You came here alone, she nodded. Yes, I thought Jonas would meet me at the station. There was no blame in her voice, yet Archer's expression grew heavier. He understood, or at least he was beginning to, that Jonas had left behind a gap too wide, too sudden, and somehow, though he hadn't asked for it, Archer was the first person standing between Eliza and that void. He sat down in the nearest chair, hands resting on his knees, head bowed slightly, a man choosing his words carefully, afraid any misstep might add to someone's hurt. Miss Eliza, I'm sorry. I didn't know Jonas ever wrote to you. No one in the family knew. His voice moved slowly, weighted, drawn from a place deep inside the place where people who learned responsibility too young buried their quiet sorrow. Eliza answered gently, You don't have to apologize for anyone. I just need to know what to do next. Her words made Archer lift his head, and his eyes, though cool, held an undeniable sincerity. The kind that made a person believe he would never speak half-truths or empty assurances. In that moment, the audience could feel the first stirrings of a very different kind of bond. A woman who no longer knew where she belonged, and a man who had returned home only to find he no longer fit where he once stood. Two souls standing at the edge of their losses, and because of that, their meeting felt undeniably fated. That rainy night ended with a silence longer than any explanation could have been. But when the first Wind Creek sunrise glowed over the small rooftops, Eliza found herself standing beside Archer Hartwell, both of them poised at the threshold of a decision. No one said aloud they needed to see the Hartwell farm, the place Jonas had described in his letters as the home of a promised future. Archer led an aging brown horse out from the rented stable behind the general store. Its coat had dulled with time, but its steps remained steady. He asked in his low voice, Do you mind riding? Hartwell Ridge is about 2 miles from here. Eliza shook her head softly. She hadn't ridden horses much, but compared to her long journey from Street Alden, one more challenge wasn't enough to turn her back. The morning wind swept across the fields, carrying the scent of dry earth and wild grass. The very smell that those who loved the old American frontier often said held the breath of freedom and of loneliness. The two of them traveled side by side, speaking little. They didn't need to. In the West, silence was often how people honored the stories others weren't ready to tell. The land opened up as they entered the stretch locals called Hartwell Ridge, a gentle rise in the earth broad like the palm of Mother Nature's hand. But as they approached, Eliza saw how deeply time had carved its scars. The wooden house, once the heart of the ranch, was now nothing more than a charred frame. The old beams leaned like weary soldiers who had survived more than one storm. Behind it, the livestock shed sagged halfway, its roof stripped clean by the wind. The ground bore blackened patches, memories of fire that refused to fade. Eliza dismounted, walking slowly toward the burned-out home. The wind brushed through the ashes, lifting gray dust into the air like fragments of an unfinished dream. Archer stood behind her, silent as always. But this time, Eliza sensed something different. He wasn't looking at this land merely as a man returning home. He was looking as someone who understood the losses carved into it. She imagined he had once stood on this very spot on a dry, windless day and watched the last chapter of his family's old life collapse into smoke. Eliza bent down and touched a beam, blackened but still firm beneath her fingertips. In the morning light, the wood seemed split into 2 halves, one scarred, one still capable of standing tall again. She murmured, not to comfort anyone but because the truth rose unbidden. it can still stand with enough hands and enough heart. Archer lifted his head, not in surprise, in recognition. He had never heard anyone speak of Hartwell Ridge like that, not even the people born and raised in Wind Creek. To them this was land gone, half dead, the place where the Hartwell brothers grew up and eventually walked away from in opposite directions. But Eliza, who had once watched her own home disappear in flames, saw something else entirely, a chance for rebirth. It was the kind of moment that made older listeners grip the arms of their chairs because they understood what it meant to see hope where others saw only ruin. It was deeply, unmistakably American in the old sense, stubborn, humble, enduring. Archer stepped closer, his voice lowered to nearly a whisper carried off by the wind. "You're not afraid, not discouraged. Most people would turn back when they see this." Eliza straightened, brushing dust from her palms. "I lost my home to fire too, and I kept going." "This isn't your home," Archer said quietly. Eliza met his gaze. "No, but it could be. If I'm allowed." The words stopped him not because they were bold, but because they were spoken with a softness so sincere it could only be believed by feeling it. Something shifted in Archer's eyes, a glimmer of respect mixed with awe. He began to understand that Eliza wasn't just a woman abandoned at a train station. She carried within her something the West valued above all else, the will to rebuild. Archer bent down, picking up a tile that had survived the fire. He turned it over in his hand. Jonas never said anything about being engaged. He never said anything about leaving the ranch like this either. Eliza said nothing. She knew this place wasn't the only thing needing restoration. A fractured family stood here too, waiting for someone patient enough to set each piece back where it belonged. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of old ash, blended with new earth. A scent, strangely comforting, as if Hartwell Ridge was breathing again because someone had finally dared to stand upon its soil with belief rather than resignation. Archer looked around, then spoke softly, almost to himself. "If Jonas were still here, maybe he'd want to hear what you just said." Simple words but heavy. There was sorrow in them, responsibility, and a past that had never been tended to. Eliza turned, taking in the entire broken landscape. Yet her voice remained soft and steady. "Hartwell Ridge isn't dead. It's just waiting for someone to believe it still has worth." To Archer, her words felt like a hand reaching out through a storm he'd weathered alone for too many years. And older listeners, the ones who had built and lost and built again, would feel the depth of that moment, the moment a person chooses to believe in what others have forgotten. That morning on Hartwell Ridge unfolded beneath a soft light like a thin cloth draped over wounds that had yet to heal. Eliza and Archer stood beneath what remained of the porch frame, sheltering themselves from the early wind. Neither hurried. The land itself didn't hurry either, as if it understood that some stories only surface when people have grown quiet enough to face themselves. Archer was tightening the horse's reins when he paused, looking out over the gentle slope in the distance. The pale yellow grass stretched to the horizon where the first rays of sun turned it into a shifting sea of grain. "It's beautiful here," Eliza whispered, as though speaking only to the wind. Archer didn't answer right away. He picked up a charred piece of wood from the ground, turned it in his hand, then let it fall as if releasing a small fragment of old memory. "Things used to be different," he began, his voice slow and carrying the weary weight of someone who had held onto hard truths for far too long. "When Jonas and I were boys, the ridge was full of life. My mama planted flowers along the fence. My father taught us how to nail every board straight, how to set every beam." He paused, eyes narrowing, as if trying to make out a past that had blurred with time. "But Jonas grew older and wanted more than a ranch caught between the wind and the dirt. He said the West was too tight for him, that a whole life couldn't fit inside a few strips of pasture and a herd of cattle." Eliza listened quietly, her fingers brushing the scorched porch post. Archer continued, "He left. No goodbye. My father couldn't bear it. My mother cried for nights. I was angry too, but not for long." A few moments of silence settled between them, not heavy but like a thread gently pulling them closer to each other's truths. Eliza asked softly, "Did you ever try to find Jonas?" Archer gave a small, thin smile, the kind that hurt more than any outright sadness she had seen. "Oh, I did. But Jonas switched jobs like other men change coats. One day he was mining, the next he was hunting elk for hire, then drifting off somewhere no one could name. Sometimes he'd send a letter, then disappear again." Eliza looked at Archer, and in that moment she understood. His pain wasn't rooted in being abandoned. It was rooted in the fact that he had tried to uphold the family's promise alone, while Jonas chose a life that never once looked back. Archer shrugged lightly, as though brushing away dust that had sat too long inside him. "And now I return only to find he promised himself to you." He looked at Eliza, as though he still couldn't quite believe it. Eliza remained quiet for a moment before opening the door to her own story, not for pity but in response to the honesty Archer had shown her. "I once thought I'd have a peaceful life too," she said, looking northward where the clouds stretched in a long band. "I used to teach. I loved the children." Archer tilted his head slightly. He clearly hadn't known this. One night, Eliza continued, voice steady like she was recounting someone else's past. "A fire burned my home to the ground. My parents were gone. My face." She touched the scar on her cheek, not hiding it, not flinching. "The school refused to take me back. They said the children would be afraid." A short sentence, but it held the quiet ache of months spent rebuilding what the world had torn down. Archer didn't say "I'm sorry." Men of the West rarely did, not because they lacked heart but because they knew condolences sometimes cut deeper than silence. Instead, he took half a step closer, close enough for Eliza to feel the steady presence of someone standing with her, not for her. "But you're still standing here," Archer said, voice firm and grounded like the earth beneath their boots. Eliza smiled, small but genuine. "Maybe because there's nowhere else left to stand." Two wounded souls found each other not through grand declarations, but through the quiet admission that both carried scars, and those scars made them see each other more clearly. Eliza asked, her voice soft like a prayer. "Do you think Jonas ever found what he was looking for?" Archer looked toward the horizon. "I don't know. But I know he always followed his own way. Even if it hurt people, he believed he'd someday build something of his own." The wind swept across Hartwell Ridge, rustling the tall grass, a sound like the whispering heartbeat of the western frontier. Eliza sat on the charred wooden step that still held the shape of the old porch. Archer stood beside her, not too close but close enough to share a quiet warmth like a small fire glowing inside a house yet to be rebuilt. If this were a video, the moment would be underscored by a slow, wistful fiddle tune, the kind of melody that makes older American listeners sigh with a deep sense of recognition. Archer looked toward the fallen beam. "Miss Eliza, Hartwell Ridge has collapsed many times. But I think it can stand again, just like you." Eliza lowered her head, unsure how to respond, but feeling something warm open inside her chest like a door that had long stayed shut, easing open at last. And in that silence a shared understanding took shape. Sometimes the most broken people are the very ones who understand how to rebuild a home, whether that home is made of land, wood, or the human heart. Night settled over Hartwell Ridge with a thin veil of mist, soft enough to soothe even the oldest scars. The wind slipped through the half-burned beams, creating a faint sound like someone sighing in the dark. Eliza and Archer built a small fire beside what remained of the foundation, its glow flickering across their faces, blending with the ash and the fragile hope beginning to take shape. Eliza sat close to the fire, holding her hands near the warmth. The past few days had been long, too long, filled with things she never planned for. Yet strangely, in all that chaos, she felt steadier than she ever had during the bleak months in Street Alden after the fire. Archer sat a short distance away, eyes fixed on the flames as though searching for an answer to the words he was gathering, the courage to say. In the shadows, Archer didn't look like the strong man who'd appeared in the rain, nor the one who carried his family's burdens alone. He looked simply like a lonely man, someone who understood how loss could close a person's heart, yet was still trying to open a path for someone else. After a long while, he finally spoke. "Eliza," he said, the first time he'd spoken her name without the formality of Miss. His voice was softer than usual, though still carrying its familiar firmness. "You came here looking for a new life. Wind Creek isn't an easy place to live, and it's even harder without someone on your side." Eliza looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight and the wary caution of someone who'd been left behind too many times. Archer continued, this time meeting her gaze, not avoiding it, not pitying her, just offering a rare kind of honesty, found only in people who have survived too much to pretend. "I can offer you that," he said, each word grounded and steady. "Not a perfect life, but a real one." Eliza froze. His words dropped into the quiet, like a piece of wood falling onto the floor, crisp, startling, too clear to ignore. Archer drew a breath as though gathering all the resolve he'd spent hours wrestling with. "If Jonas doesn't come back, people will talk. Folks here aren't cruel, but they remember long and speak often. I don't want you to bear that." He paused, broad shoulders tightening. "And this ranch, it needs 2 people if it's ever going to stand again. I can't rebuild it alone." Eliza felt her heart tighten, not because of the offer but because of the respect woven into the way he said it. Archer made no promises of romance. He painted no bright future. He wasn't trying to rescue her. He was simply offering a truth and a proposal that was unmistakably Archer, direct, practical, slightly clumsy in its sincerity. "Eliza, I have something to ask you." He looked straight at her, the fire reflecting in those sharp, honest, gray eyes. "If you're willing, we could marry. It would give you a place here, and give Hartwell Ridge a fighting chance." Eliza went still. Even the night wind seemed to pause. She had come to Wind Creek to marry Jonas, a man she'd never met. And now she was sitting before a man who resembled Jonas in a way that hurt at first glance, yet the more she looked, the more she saw how different they truly were, like firelight and shadow. Archer's voice dropped lower. "I don't want you thinking I'm doing this out of pity. And I don't want you bound by Jonas's promise, a promise even he didn't keep." Eliza shook her head softly. "Archer, I don't know what to say." "Just say what's true," he replied. His eyes, for the first time since she'd known him, softened. "Do you want to leave this place?" Eliza looked around, Hartwell Ridge, the burnt grass, the fallen house, the collapsed barn, and strangely none of it looked bleak anymore. She saw what could be rebuilt, what could be healed, what could become a home. "No," she whispered. "I don't want to leave." In that moment, Archer released a long breath, not relief exactly, but the sound of a man setting down a burden he had carried all the way back to this land. Eliza looked at him, then down at her hands clasped in her lap. "But marriage, to me, it's something serious. I won't live leaning on someone else." Archer nodded. "I don't want anything built on reluctance." The wind stirred, making the fire lift in a warm, golden leap. "Then," Eliza said, her voice thin but steady, "if we do this, it has to be real. Slow but real." Archer bowed his head slightly. "Slow and real. I give you my word." In the West, some promises didn't need oaths spoken with the right steadiness, they were carved into wood. Only after several moments did Eliza realize her hands had stopped trembling. She had come to Wind Creek out of desperation and a broken promise. But tonight, under the humble fire of Hartwell Ridge, she stood before a different promise. Not one made by a man who left everything behind, but by a man who stayed, who carried responsibility like a second skin, who could look straight at her, pain, and not turn away. And that, more than anything, made Eliza's heart tremble softly, like it was coming alive for the first time since the fire. Dawn had promised a new day, but it was nightfall that led Eliza to the true crossroads. It was the night Hartwell Ridge stopped being merely the ruined land belonging to the Hartwell brothers, and instead became the place where Eliza had to face herself, the things she'd left behind, in street Alden, and the things she'd never dared to dream of in this unfamiliar Western world. The night wind drifted through the charred wooden posts, carrying the early spring chill. The fire in their makeshift pit flickered slowly, lighting Eliza's face, the scar, the exhaustion, and something new just beginning to take shape: determination. Archer had made his proposal hours earlier, but he hadn't pushed, hadn't urged. After speaking, he had simply added more wood to the fire, as though he understood that a decision of that size could only form when a heart was calm enough to hear its own voice. Eliza sat a few steps away, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Above them, the faint stars shone down on a woman who had traveled farther than any map could measure, from a dismissed schoolteacher in Street Alden to a wanderer standing before a future no one could define for her. She closed her eyes. And the old familiar question rose like a breath from the past. If I go back to Street Alden, what exactly am I going back to? She didn't want to answer, but the answer found her anyway. Pitying stares, the sympathetic nods of kind people, the cramped cot in her aunt's house. She never once considered home, and the whispers, poor thing. If only she didn't have that scar. Eliza opened her eyes. Before her was Hartwell Ridge, ruined, broken, yet not looking at her with pity. It simply stood there waiting for someone to believe it could live again. And beside her was Archer, a man who promised nothing except the truth, and an offer that did not require her to become anyone but herself. Archer stepped closer, placing a cup of warm water beside her, steam rising like soft morning fog. He offered it with both hands, carefully ensuring his fingers didn't touch hers. A small gesture, but one Eliza recognized instantly for what it was: respect. "You should drink something warm," Archer said, his voice low and steady like the rhythm of a horse's hooves on a dirt road. Eliza accepted the cup with a grateful look. They sat in silence for a while longer, not tense, not awkward, just two people trying to find a way across the parts of their lives that had once broken them. At last, Eliza set the cup down. The wind brushed through her hair, carrying a bit of the ranch's ash with it. "Archer." She said his name carefully, as if every word needed to be measured. "You know marriage isn't a small thing." "I know," Archer answered immediately, not avoiding her gaze. "And I know it wouldn't be fair to pretend it's something easy." Eliza looked at him for the first time in days, not defensively but searchingly. "But I think," she touched a piece of unburnt wood on the post beside the fire, "if we're going to build something, it needs to be real. Not because of anyone else. Not because of Jonas's promise, but because of us." Archer went still, not out of surprise, but because her words struck something deep inside him, a place he had kept sealed for years. Eliza continued, her voice soft but firm, like a hammer tapping a tent stake into hard ground. "Slow is fine, hard is fine, but I want it honest." Archer looked at her for a long time, long enough that Eliza could hear his heavy but steady breaths beneath the cold night sky. Finally, he nodded, not a grand gesture but one carrying the weight of a man who had seen things fall apart and was willing to rebuild them from nothing. "Eliza," he said, his voice dropping into a tone that felt like a vow, "I promise you this. If we do this, it will be real. Every board, every fence, every word we speak to each other." Eliza pressed her lips together, her eyes glistening not from sorrow but because someone was finally asking for her truth instead of deciding it for her. Then, her voice trembled lightly yet held unmistakable resolve, "I agree." For a brief moment the wind stopped, as if Hartwell Ridge itself had paused to hear her words. Archer didn't smile widely, he wasn't that kind of man, but his eyes softened in a way only those who had buried their loneliness for too long could allow themselves to show. "Thank you," he whispered. "I won't make you regret it." Eliza took a long breath. She had no certainty about the future, but for the first time in years her heart wasn't shrinking from fear. She wasn't being rescued. She was being chosen, and she had chosen too. That morning the wind carried the gentle warmth of March, as if trying to soothe the last cold days of the season. Eliza and Archer walked down the road leading into Wind Creek Flats, their steps neither hurried nor hesitant, as though the decision born on that long night at Hartwell Ridge had already settled, and they simply needed to let life guide them toward what came next. The Wind Creek Church stood at the end of the street beside an ancient elm the townsfolk said had been there long before the town ever had a name. A dark brown wooden roof, a fresh coat of white on the picket fence each spring, and a small bronze bell hanging above all, simple yet bearing the enduring beauty of things tended with heart. When Eliza and Archer stepped onto the church steps, the door was already open. No whispers, no curious stares. Only warm candlelight spilling out like a quiet flame that had been waiting for them for a very long time. Maeve Callahan was the first to approach, draping a cream-colored wool shawl over Eliza's shoulders. "It's still a bit chilly, dear," she said, her voice as warm as fresh-baked bread. Eliza nodded softly, her eyes stinging not from the wind. Inside the small sanctuary, nearly 30 townspeople sat neatly in the pews. No one had come out of curiosity. In the West, folks respected privacy the way they respected their own land. They were there because they wanted the morning sun to lend its blessing to two souls who had endured more sorrow than most and still found the courage to rise. Elliot Callahan adjusted Archer's collar, an unfamiliar gesture for a man used to living entirely on his own. "Son," he murmured, "take life slow. A Western man doesn't need many words, just a kept promise." Archer only nodded. He was not a man who displayed emotion easily, but Eliza saw the tension in his shoulders ease. Maybe for the first time in years, Archer felt he wasn't stepping into something alone. The small church glowed with more than a dozen candles lining the aisle. Their golden light made the room feel familiar, as if Eliza had already stood here many times before. When the bronze bell chimed, Pastor Hargrove, a silver-haired man with an autumn-soft face, stepped toward the wooden pulpit. Eliza stood beside Archer. She held no flowers, wore no veil, brought nothing except the resolve shaped from so many silent, difficult nights. Archer glanced at her briefly. His eyes held that same steady calm, but now there was a faint light within them, a spark of belief she had never seen in him before. The pastor looked at them, his seasoned gaze filled with the understanding of a man who had watched dozens of couples walk through this wooden doorway. "Archer Hartwell," he began, his voice slow and sure like the heartbeat of the Western Plains. "Do you take Eliza Morrow as your companion for the days ahead, in wealth or want, in strength, or in breaking, in peace or in storm?" Archer didn't turn toward the pastor. He looked straight at Eliza. His eyes no longer guarded, no longer distant, only honest, the kind of honesty belonging to a man who didn't make many promises, but kept the ones he did until his last breath. "I do," he said, deep, clear, certain, like a hammer driving a nail into the beam of a new home. No hesitation at all. Eliza felt her heart go still for a beat, not from surprise, but because she sensed the words were not shaped by duty or pressure. They were for her. Truly, for her. The pastor turned to Eliza, his eyes gentle like candlelight. "Eliza, do you choose to take Archer Hartwell into this new path where you are no longer the one left behind, but the one who helps build a home anew?" Eliza swallowed softly and looked around the sanctuary. No one stared at the scar on her right cheek. No one gave her the pitying look that had once hurt worse than the fire that stole her family. They looked at her with respect, with trust, with quiet nods from people who understood what loss meant. She turned back to Archer. He was not perfect, neither was she. But in his eyes, and in the warmth of this community, Eliza recognized something she had long believed she'd lost. A place to stand without asking permission. "Yes," Eliza said, her voice trembling slightly, but not with weakness. "I do." A few women smiled softly. Elliot laid a hand on Maeve's shoulder. Archer bowed his head just a bit, a gesture of gratitude for her answer. Pastor Hargrove smiled, the kind of smile that had witnessed hundreds of life stories inside this wooden church. "Then, before God and the community of Wind Creek, I declare you husband and wife." There was no loud applause, no cheers. Only a gentle warmth spreading through the room, the kind of warmth the frontier cherished, where people respected the journey more than the destination. Archer turned to Eliza. He didn't reach for her hand just yet. He simply whispered with a promise only meant for the two of them, "Thank you for staying." Eliza didn't answer. She only nodded. And in that moment her soul, once filled with ash, felt something she hadn't known in years, a quiet hope. After the quiet wedding in the wooden church, Eliza and Archer returned to Hartwell Ridge, like two people beginning a journey no one had mapped out for them. On the walk back to the ranch, the afternoon wind carried the scent of fresh earth, wild grass, and something else, the hint of change coming slowly but surely. Just like the pace the two of them had chosen for a marriage without frills yet full of truth. On their first morning together, Eliza stood before the surviving frame of the house, feeling as if she were looking at her own heart after it had broken, not perfect, not whole, but with enough patience and enough faith rebuildable. Archer handed her a brand new pair of gloves fitting her hands as if made for them. "We'll start with the roof," he said, his voice low but warm like a patch of sunlight on the porch of the old home. Eliza nodded. She had never built a house before, but she learned quickly, and Archer noticed that almost immediately. They raised each beam, each plank piece by piece. Archer taught through short instructions, never raising his voice. The way he spoke made Eliza feel she wasn't being helped, but truly partnering in the work. When it came time to dig out the ground for the livestock shed, Archer said, "Step on the dug soil. You'll know if it's right. Soft ground means you dig deeper." Eliza did as instructed, and within hours she could already tell where the land dipped, where it held moisture, things Western folk learned by experience, and she was learning through her own hands. By noon they sat beneath the old elm for shade. Eliza drank from the tin water flask, her hands smeared with dust and soot, yet she had never felt so belonging to any place. Archer sat beside her, quiet as always, but something in him had changed. Not that he talked more, Archer would never be that type of man, but his silence had softened. Less guarded, less heavy. When Eliza asked, "You really worked in the mines?" Archer nodded. 7 years. Down in Drum River. Was it hard? Archer let out a short, rare laugh, so unexpected, Eliza lifted her head. Hard doesn't begin to cover it. You sleep at night hearing rock shifting under you. Folks lose a friend in the blink of an eye. He paused, not out of fear, but because the memory brushed against a tender place. I was there because I thought I needed to go far, that I had something to prove. He shrugged slightly. Those years I thought I was strong. Looking back, maybe I was just running. Eliza let him speak. Western men had a way of talking about pain that was never dramatic, quiet, sparse, yet heavy as stone. And when a man like Archer, who wrapped himself in silence like armor, opened up, it felt like a flower blooming out of rock. Archer turned to her. "And you, in Street Alden, what did you leave behind?" Eliza tightened the gloves in her lap. "The old house, my old job, a part of myself." "Do you regret it?" Eliza thought a moment, then shook her head. "I regret losing my parents. Everything else, I lived long enough to learn that a home isn't made from straight boards or pretty walls, it's made from the people inside it." Archer didn't reply, but his eyes softened again. Eliza returned to work, and only when she heard Archer quietly exhale did she realize it was the sound of release, like a man who had held loneliness too long and finally found someone to share it with. Later that afternoon, while repairing the front door, Eliza caught a splinter in her hand. Archer touched her wrist gently, careful not to hurt her more. "Let me see," Eliza laughed. "I'm fine, Archer. I taught a bunch of rowdy children. Splinters were a daily thing." He smiled more clearly than he had earlier that day. Then, "Hartwell Ridge is in good hands. With you here, I think it won't collapse again." Eliza flushed, not at the compliment itself, but at the sincerity in his tone. By evening, the two of them stood admiring the newly raised section of roof. The wind shifted westward, carrying scents of grass and new beginnings. They stood side by side, saying nothing. But the silence held more meaning than any words could. Eliza felt her heart loosen. Archer felt a weight slide from his shoulders. And Hartwell Ridge, a land battered by years of wind and loss, seemed to breathe again beneath their feet. As Eliza reached for the hammer, Archer let out a laugh, clearer, warmer than before. "What is it?" she asked. Archer shook his head, still smiling. "You're holding that hammer like someone who's worked here her whole life." Eliza looked down at her hands, then laughed with him. The sound rose into the open prairie, carried by the wind, recorded by the land itself, because it was the first time they had laughed together. It was a simple moment, yet precious, like a wildflower rising out of stone, slow, difficult, but enduring. In the days after the roof was partially rebuilt, Hartwell Ridge began to breathe again. The morning air felt less cold, the wind against the new planks sounded different, like a guitar, newly tuned, still rustic but no longer worn thin. And within that rhythm of life, something else was quietly beginning to take root, a feeling neither of them dared to name, yet both sensed clearly, like the warmth of a fire before dusk. Eliza was growing accustomed to ranch work, checking the stalls, clearing the water trough, taking notes on the land. Each morning she heard Archer's footsteps out in the yard. His steps were slow, steady, consistent, much so that Eliza could guess the weather from them alone. When rain was coming, his steps were heavier. When the day was fair, his tread barely pressed the earth. One afternoon, while repairing the northern fence, Archer miscalculated a strike, and the nail snapped back, cutting the skin beside his thumb joint. Blood beaded up, but Archer only tightened his jaw, a tiny reaction from someone used to bearing pain without troubling anyone. Eliza rushed over when she saw the plank fall. "Let me see your hand." Archer shook his head. "It's nothing." Archer, Eliza said again soft but unmistakably firm. Let me see. He went quiet, then held out his hand. As Eliza pressed a clean cloth over the wound, Archer lowered his gaze, avoiding her eyes the way a man would when he's not used to letting anyone witness his pain. Eliza spoke gently, her voice like an invitation to step through a door he'd kept locked for years. You don't have to do everything alone. Archer looked up. His eyes weren't as guarded as usual. They softened, carrying something like acceptance or gratitude he didn't know how to voice. The wind swept across the ridge, carrying the scent of soil and fresh lumber, and Eliza realized the moment was precious, precisely because it needed no embellishment. Older folks often say real affection grows from simple things: a small injury, a hand tending it, a quiet sentence that touches the hidden fracture in someone's heart. In the following days, the wind changed direction, signaling a storm moving in from the western mountains. Wind Creek Flats was used to March storm, short-lived but fierce enough to test any newly raised roof. That night, gusts rose in harsh bursts, whistling through the gaps in the boards like the land itself was sighing. Archer inspected the roof one last time before darkness settled. We might need another brace, he said, otherwise the wind will take this section down. Eliza pulled on her coat and stepped out beside him. Then, let's do it. They worked on the makeshift scaffolding, the wind whipping their faces like thousands of tiny needles. The rain hadn't fallen yet, but the air carried that sharp chill unique to western storms. Archer held the rope. Eliza steadied the beam. The wind roared hard enough that Eliza nearly lost her balance, but Archer caught her shoulder. Careful, he said, his voice clear even through the storm. Eliza nodded, gripping the wood tightly. In the wind, in the dark, with the first scattered drops beginning to fall, they said nothing grand or dramatic. But their steps synchronized, their breaths aligned, and each time Archer glanced her way, Eliza saw a quiet trust growing in his eyes, trust, born only when two people face something larger than themselves together. When the section of roof was secured, they stepped back at the same time, exhaling in unison. Eliza sat on the newly set porch step, brushing the rain from her forehead. Archer sat beside her, one hand braced on his knee, his breaths heavy but steady. "Thank you," Archer said, one of his rare spoken thanks. Eliza smiled. "I was just doing my part." Archer turned his gaze deep as damp earth in the night. "No," he said softly. "You do more than that, and I see it." Eliza didn't answer, but she felt the warmth rise in her fast no. From flattery, but from something gentler, steadier. The feeling of being seen, not out of pity but out of recognition. The wind still blew, but the roof held firm. And so did something inside them, something quietly standing stronger than before. A small warmth, steady and bright like a seedling pushing through stone. Slow, unrushed, but unmistakably growing. And those older viewers, those who had lived through many shapes of love, would recognize in that moment the kind of truth they value most, a love that doesn't need to be declared, only lived through everyday acts in the winds of the western frontier. In the days after the storm passed, Hartwell Ridge grew quieter, like someone who had endured pain yet exhaled softly because they were still standing. In that quiet, Eliza began finding new rhythms: the rooster's crow at dawn, the sound of hooves in the yard, Archer's steady tapping on wooden beams as he checked the roof for cracks. And then one morning life opened a door she once believed had been shut forever. Dr. Aldous Granger, a 60-year-old physician with the gentle look of a man who had spent his whole life tending a small town, stopped by Hartwell Ridge to recheck Archer's hand injury from the mishap earlier that week. When he saw Eliza writing notes about the soil condition in the eastern garden plot, he narrowed his eyes as if recalling something stored in memory. "Miss Morrow," he called, his voice steady and slightly raspy from years of talking into the wind. "Eliza, doctor," she corrected softly, wiping her hands on her cloth apron. Dr. Granger glanced at her notebook, neat handwriting, orderly lines, nothing rushed. "You've got fine penmanship. And I hear from Mrs. Callahan you once taught school." Eliza hesitated, not because of the question but because of how deeply it echoed inside her chest. "Yes," she answered slowly. "But it's been a long time." Dr. Granger smiled kindly. "In Wind Creek, nothing is ever too long to begin again." He continued without pause, as though he had been considering this for days. "Would you like to teach the children? The town school is short-handed. just a few sessions a week, arithmetic and reading. I know you'd do well." Eliza opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had once taught. She had once loved the work dearly, and she had lost it, not through fault of her own, but because the world beyond had not been generous enough to see her worth beyond the scar she carried. Archer walked in from the yard just in time to hear the last half of the conversation. He stood by the doorway, silent, not intruding, but his eyes made something clear. No one here saw her as someone less than. Eliza took a slow breath. I'll try," she said, quiet but sure. Her first class took place in the small wooden room behind the Wind Creek Church. Sunlight streamed through thin window panes, drawing narrow gold stripes across the desks. A dozen children, dirt-smudged faces, bright western-wide eyes sat so neatly that Eliza couldn't help smiling. She wrote the first numbers on the board. Her hand trembled slightly. No one noticed but her. A tousle-haired boy of about 8 looked up and asked, "Mom, is that a scar on your face?" Eliza paused mid-stroke. The entire room fell silent. There was no cruelty in his gaze, only the honest curiosity of a child who didn't yet know how pain can live inside a person. Eliza set the chalk down, turned and knelt so she was eye-level with him. Her voice was soft enough that even the wind outside the window could hear it. "Yes," she said, "it's a scar." The boy's eyes widened. "Did it hurt, ma'am?" Eliza smiled, and that smile seemed to brighten the entire room. "Not anymore," she said. She placed a gentle hand on her cheek. "But it's like a little map of what I've been through." And now she looked around the classroom at all the long lashes, eager eyes, and patient curiosity. "I'm drawing a new map." The children glanced at one another, then nodded with a simple understanding unique to the very young. No one asked anything further. And Eliza realized she had just stepped over the greatest fear still lingering in her heart. The lesson went on, and for the first time in years, Eliza felt her spirit standing tall again. When a child understood something, their eyes lit up like sparks. When she wrote on the board, her hand grew steadier. Not because she'd forgotten her past, but because her past no longer ruled her. After class, Archer stood by the gate, leaning against the white fence, watching from afar. Not wanting to distract her, not wanting to step in too soon. Eliza approached, clutching her notebook to her chest. "Was it all right?" Archer asked, his voice low but full of genuine concern. Eliza nodded, her eyes shimmering with something new. "I think I've found a part of myself again." Archer met her gaze, and Eliza knew he saw exactly what she was feeling. She was no longer the woman who came to Wind Creek because she had nowhere else to go. She was becoming a woman who had a place to stand and to give. Archer didn't say much. He simply replied, "Wind Creek's lucky to have you." The simple sentence from a man who rarely offered praise made something quiet settle gratefully in Eliza's heart. She turned toward the little schoolhouse, whose door had just swung closed, where chalk dust still drifted in the afternoon light. A home, a ranch, a classroom, each piece was returning to her, slowly but surely. And older listeners, those who had lived through losses of their own, would know this truth more deeply than anyone. No journey of healing is complete until a person rediscovers their work, their purpose, and their belief in their own worth. Eliza had done exactly that. And Archer, though he never said it aloud, knew she was the very light Hartwell Ridge had been waiting for all those long years. The days Eliza returned to teaching brought warmth back into her life, but it was the fateful morning at Hartwell Ridge that showed her something unmistakable in the West. No one truly stands alone if they're willing to open the door and let others in. And the community of Wind Creek Flats proved that in the simplest, most beautiful way possible, true to every old value of this land. Word that Hartwell Ridge's old barn needed rebuilding spread through the town in just 2 days. Eliza didn't know who mentioned it first, and Archer didn't ask. But by Saturday morning, as the sun cast gold across the hill, wagons began rolling down the long dirt road. The first to step off was Elliot Callahanhammer, in hand sleeves rolled up the posture of a man who'd spent a lifetime helping others. Then came the lumbermen from the north side of town, then ranchers from along Creekline River, and then the women carrying baskets of bread, pots of eggs, and heavy shawls to shade the workers from the midday sun. Eliza stood on the porch, overwhelmed as each familiar face approached. Archer stood beside her in silence, resting his hand on a post as if reminding himself This was real. When Elliot reached them, he said, a single sentence, the kind of thing only old Western folk say, full of tradition and heart. A new barn takes many hands. Today we're your hands. Eliza bowed her head. Archer did too. Neither of them could find words. Work began with the sun still low on the horizon. Hammers rang out in steady rhythm, sheavy, then light fast, then slow like the heartbeat of an entire community working for one purpose. Archer was placed in charge of directing the main frame. The other men followed his signals without argument or doubt. Eliza noticed how deeply they respected Archer, quietly, earnestly, because they knew he had carried more loss than most, and this was the first time he had let others step into something that once rested entirely on his shoulders. Meanwhile, Eliza joined Maeve and the women in setting up the outdoor kitchen. They cooked bean stew, roasted potatoes, smoked meat broth, and warm cornbread, foods that comfort the soul at any barn raising. Eliza felt anxious, at first worried she didn't quite belong. But Maeve simply looped an arm around her shoulders, her voice warm as a hot cup of tea on a cold morning. In Wind Creek, anyone with a good heart is family. No one needs to hand you a title. Eliza laughed, a soft, genuine laugh, without the old tremor of someone afraid of being judged. The other women shared stories, husbands gone for long winter months, mischievous children, hens insisting on laying eggs in odd corners of the yard. Nothing grand but full of life. And in that moment, Eliza realized she was being welcomed not out of pity, but because they saw a woman rebuilding her life with honest hands. By noon, the main frame of the barn stood tall. Archer stood beside the raised timber, watching the men secure each beam. Sunlight rested on his shoulders, and for the first time, Eliza saw something rare on his face. He was smiling. Not a polite smile, not a fleeting softness, but a real one, the smile of a man finally seeing something larger than the pain he once carried. Elliot Callahan placed a hand on Archer's shoulder. "Hartwell Ridge stands again, son." Archer only nodded, but his chest rose and fell like someone who had finally set down a burden he'd carried far too long. When the workers paused for lunch, Archer quietly walked to where Eliza was handing out cornbread to the children. He stood beside her, silent for a few moments, as if searching for the right words. "Eliza," he said, voice low but steady, "they didn't do this just for me. They did it for both of us." Eliza looked up, and the truth of his words warmed her eyes. "For us," she corrected gently but firmly. Archer nodded. "For us." By late afternoon, the new barn was complete. The fresh wood glowed under the sunlight like a sign of renewal off the land of their lives and of the two people who had stood before ruin and chosen to rebuild together. When the final beam was secured, Elliot shouted, "That's it!" A soft cheer rose from the townsfolk, not loud but full of warmth. Eliza looked at Archer, and Archer, who rarely showed anything, smiled a smile Hartwell Ridge would never forget. The smile of a man who finally believed he had a home, and not one he built alone. Eliza stood beside him, her hand brushing the edge of his coat. No one needed to say they had become a family. The community had already said it for them through the work of their own hands. Older viewers, those who had lived through many seasons and many changes, would understand this deeply. A barn isn't raised just to shelter livestock. It's raised to shelter two hearts that had weathered too many storms. The evening after the barn raising, Hartwell Ridge wore a calm Eliza had never seen since arriving in this land. The sky was so clear she could see stars deep as a well. The breeze carried the scent of fresh timber, of soil being reborn, and of human warmth. Eliza stood on the front porch, her hand resting on the newly oiled railing Elliot had rubbed with pine resin. For the first time she felt this house was no longer a place that needed saving, but a place slowly becoming a true home. Inside, the lamplight cast Archer's shadow across the curtain. He was checking tools the way he did every night. But tonight his footsteps were lighter, his posture less guarded, like a man whose burdens had finally grown thinner, thanks to the helping hands of Wind Creek. When Eliza stepped back in, Archer looked up, gray eyes reflecting the warm glow. "Tired?" he asked, his voice low and familiar enough now that Eliza realized she had grown used to hearing it each day. "No," she answered, glancing toward the door. "Today was a good day." Archer didn't add anything, but Eliza knew he felt the same. It wasn't just a day of raising a barn, it was a day of being lifted in the truest Western sense of family and neighbors. The next morning they went into town to return a few borrowed tools. Wind Creek Flats had quickly become a place where Eliza no longer felt like she was passing through. When she stepped into the Callahan's general store, Maeve looked at her with the warm gaze of morning sunlight. "Eliza," Maeve said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, "you and Archer, you look like two folks who weathered the same storm long before you ever met." Eliza laughed softly, a gentle, unguarded laugh. "Maybe we did." Maeve continued, her voice full of wisdom without prying. "When the storm's gone, hold on to the peace, child. It doesn't come often in a lifetime." The words made Eliza pause, not because Maeve knew too much, but because she knew exactly what needed saying. The elders of Wind Creek had a way of seeing truths the younger ones hadn't yet learned to name. And now Eliza understood this community already saw her and Archer as part of them, as naturally as breathing. On the ride home, Archer suddenly asked without looking at her, his voice low and steady like he was probing something he'd never spoken aloud. "Eliza, what do you want Hartwell Ridge to become one day?" Eliza blinked. That question wasn't about land or work. It was the kind of question a man asks only when he truly sees a future with the woman riding beside him. She looked out toward the low hills where the grass was shifting into a soft spring green. "I want a place where children laugh. A place with a warm kitchen. A place someone would want to return to no matter how far they roam." Archer was quiet for a long moment. Then gently he said, "I want that too." No grand declarations, no poetic promises. But that small sentence rooted itself deeper in Eliza's heart than anything else could. By late afternoon they returned to Hartwell Ridge. On the front porch stood Dr. Granger, his old leather satchel at his side. "Just checking if you two are all right after yesterday," he said in his steady, weathered voice. "And I wanted to bring this." He opened the satchel and pulled out a stack of children's notebooks. "Eliza, the little ones liked your lesson. They wanted to write more for you." Eliza opened a small notebook. Inside was a crooked sentence: "You are the best teacher because you know how to listen to us." Her hand stilled. Her heart opened a little wider. She had once believed her teaching career had died in the ashes of her old home in Street Alden, but in Wind Creek it was sprouting again like fresh grass after a rain. "Dr." Granger looked at Archer, then at both of them. "Wind Creek needs folks like you. Places like this survive because of steady hearts." Archer nodded with simple respect. Eliza couldn't hide her emotion. In this town people didn't flatter, so a small compliment carried the weight of a lifetime's trust. That evening they sat on the porch, the firelight from inside casting a soft glow like an old memory. Archer rested his arms on his knees while Eliza clutched the wool shawl Maeve had gifted her. "What do you think?" Archer asked. "About everything." Here Eliza looked out into the tender darkness surrounding Hartwell Ridge, a gentle breeze, warm earth, bright stars, and the man beside her revealing more of himself each day, steady, quiet, protective in ways he didn't speak aloud. "I think," Eliza said, her voice as soft as the shawl warming her hands, "I'm coming back to life." Archer turned to her, his eyes gentle enough to loosen something inside her chest. "You deserve that," he said quietly. "And I'm glad you're here." It wasn't a confession, but it carried the weight of someone who had been hurt deeply and who did not speak such things unless he meant every word. Eliza knew that. And because she knew she felt the life inside her life, she thought the fire had taken forever returning fully. Not because someone saved her, not because she owed anyone anything, but because two wounded hearts had chosen to stand beside each other and to look ahead. After the barn raising, Hartwell Ridge looked like a patch of land learning to breathe again. The new roof shone in the sun, the fences had been mended, and from the kitchen, Eliza could hear the steady rhythm of Archer sawing wood like the heartbeat of a home that had finally found its keeper. But peace in the West was always fragile, as thin as the surface of a still pond touched by the slightest wind. On that quiet afternoon, the sound of hooves rose from the eastern road slow, heavy dragging dust and an unmistakable sense of trouble. Eliza stepped onto the porch, her hand tightening around her wool shawl without thinking. Archer followed her out, and his face darkened the moment he saw the black carriage approaching. No one in town used such a carriage, except people who came to collect debts, deliver bad news, or dispute land. The horse stopped at the fence. The man who stepped down was Silas Hartwell, the eldest of the Hartwell brothers, the one Archer had mentioned, with a mixture of distance and an old ache he'd never fully explained. Silas stood tall, his long coat dusty from travel, yet his voice sharp and measured as if he'd stepped out of a busy office rather than a rough stretch of prairie. Eliza Morrow, Silas greeted her with a polite, distant nod. Then he turned to Archer. "Little brother." Archer didn't answer. His gaze was deep and unreadable like a moonless night. Silas opened a leather case and pulled out a stack of papers sealed in red wax. "I'm here about Hartwell Ridge," he said bluntly. "Caleb signed over full management rights to me before leaving Wind Creek. By law, I have the authority to reclaim this land." Eliza heard each word clearly, and each one seemed to thicken the air around them. Archer kept his voice low, tense, every syllable worn like a blade that had been used too many times. "Caleb abandoned this land. We rebuilt it. The community helped. We." Silas raised a hand, cutting him off. "The law doesn't deal in emotion, Archer. Land unclaimed is land considered vacant. Caleb is the rightful heir, and I represent him now." A gust of wind swept across the ridge, carrying the scent of dry grass and a trace of dust from the barn roof they'd just raised. Eliza saw Archer's shoulders tighten, not from anger but from the familiar sting of being left behind by family one time too many. She stepped forward and stood beside him. Her hand trembled slightly, but her gaze was steadier than ever. "Mr. Hartwell," Eliza said softly but firmly, "this land is not abandoned. We brought it back. We made it breathe again." Silas studied her, as though truly seeing the woman standing beside his brother for the first time. There was no cruelty in his eyes, only the rigid resolve of a man who trusted logic more than mercy. "A commendable effort," Silas said, "but it doesn't change the fact that the land isn't yours." The air seemed to turn colder. A slow chill crawled along Eliza's spine, not because of his words, but because she understood what they touched Archer's deepest fear. Losing the one thing he had only just begun to believe could be his. Archer drew a slow breath and steadied his voice. "Silas, look around you. This land is alive again because of Wind Creek, because of the people, because of us." Caleb walked away. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking to keep what I've built with my own hands." Silas narrowed his eyes, an expression of a man weighing things but not leaning toward mercy. "I understand what you want, Archer. But I'm here to fulfill an obligation. This land must return to its rightful heir, or be reassigned according to law." Eliza instinctively stepped back half a pace, but Archer immediately placed a gentle hand on her arm. Not possessive, not desperate. A quiet reassurance. "I'm still standing. With you." She looked at him, and in Archer's eyes, she didn't just see fear of losing Hartwell Ridge. She saw fear of losing her. Fear of losing the home they'd dared to imagine. Eliza straightened and faced Silas again. "We're not asking for favors. We're only asking to keep what we've brought back to life. Hartwell Ridge isn't just land. It's the first place since the fire where I've felt I could live again." Silas froze just for a heartbeat. Then he closed the leather case. "I'll return in a few days," he said. "I hope the two of you will consider what's best." He climbed onto the carriage and flicked the reins. The wheels rolled away, leaving behind a long, heavy silence. Archer stood still, eyes fixed on the disappearing shape of his brother until it vanished behind the ridge. Eliza didn't touch him. She simply stood beside him, close enough that their breaths blended in the wind. "Archer," she whispered. He lifted a hand and touched the new barn roof, almost as if to make sure it was still real. "You see," he said quietly, his voice rough, "what we build, someone can still try to take away." Eliza shook her head. "Not everything." Archer looked at her. In those deep gray eyes, for the first time, Eliza saw a storm, gathering not anger at Silas, but raw fear of losing what he'd only just begun to hope for: peace. Eliza stepped closer, determination bright in her eyes like a lantern in a dark room. "We won't give up just because someone says we don't have the right," she said. "We have something stronger than papers, Archer. We have the community. We have Hartwell Ridge. And we have each other." Archer didn't answer right away. But his silence wasn't cold, it was the silence of a man slowly letting himself believe in something he'd never dared hope for. The evening fell slowly, The wind carried the scent of new straw but also the uneasy whisper of the days ahead. Eliza and Archer stood beneath the porch looking out over the land they'd rebuilt with their hands and their hearts. Peace had never felt so fragile, but neither had they ever stood so firmly. Evening fell over Hartwell Ridge in a deep, burnished redas, if the sun were hanging on a little longer, trying to warm the land before the cold night could claim it. Eliza stood at the window watching that last strip of light sink behind the hills. She hadn't felt steady since Silas rode away, and even the breeze tonight carried a sharper edge whispering of something approaching. She turned when she heard Archer's footsteps on the porch, slow, heavy, the steps of a man walking through a battle no one else could see. Archer stepped inside, his face darker than the fading sky, and his eyes no longer held the quiet light they'd shared after finishing the new barn. Eliza knew he needed time, so she stayed silent, letting him find his own way to the words. It took several long minutes before he finally exhaled. "Silas didn't just come about the land," he said quietly. "He came to tell me Caleb is coming back." The name Caleb, the man she had never met, yet the very reason she came west, fell between them like a jagged stone. Eliza sat on the wooden chair, gripping her shawl, though her voice stayed calm. "Do you believe him?" Archer nodded once. "Silas doesn't bluff. Caleb, he's always been the favored one. If he wants to reclaim everything, the family will stand with him." That sadness didn't belong to Archer alone. Eliza could feel the old wound opening, one that wasn't visible but cut deeper than the scar on her own face. Archer had grown up in a silence he never chose, carrying burdens. No one thanked him for always believing he was the one who stood behind, never beside. News like this would land on him like a familiar blade. Eliza rose and stepped to his side. She placed her hand on his arm, not to pull him close, but to steady him, a quiet reminder, "You're not alone anymore." "Archer," she said gently, "Hartwell Ridge is alive because of you. Not Caleb, not Silas, you." Archer lowered his head. His hand curled into a fist, yet his voice dropped to something fragile, rare and raw. "But the law doesn't care about that." Eliza lifted her chin, meeting his gaze, those gray eyes that once looked as cold as forged steel, now softening like they might break. "Then we care," she said. "And we fight. This land isn't some dead piece of dirt. It's the first place I've felt at home since the fire. It's where you found yourself again. We don't let go just because someone says we should." Archer held her eyes for a long, quiet stretch. She knew he wasn't fighting Caleb or Silas. In that momentha, was fighting the old shadow inside him, the belief that he didn't deserve to keep anything that mattered. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and slow. "Eliza, if Caleb comes back, he could try to take you too. He was the one you were supposed to marry, the reason you came here." Eliza shook her head immediately, her eyes warm but fierce, like a small flame burning through the dark. "I came here because of a letter, but I stayed because of you." The words fell into the room like warm water touching cracked soil. Archer breathed out, not in despair but like a man finding the last bit of light in a long night. They walked out onto the porch as the sky turned purple. The wind carried the scent of new lumber and young grass, things that hadn't existed on Hartwell Ridge just weeks before. Far off, the lights of Wind Creek Flats flickered through the dusk. Eliza knew that if they asked tomorrow, the whole town would stand behind them, just like they did on barn-raising day. But tonight, what they needed most was to stand beside each other. Archer looked down at his hands, worn from years of labor, hands that had rebuilt a home, hands that had once trembled when he offered her that first cup of coffee. "I've lost a lot in my life," Archer said, "but this is the first time I'm afraid of losing the thing I want most." Eliza understood the part he couldn't say out loud. He was afraid of losing her. She laid her hand over his, soft, steady enough to send warmth through his skin. "Archer, I'm not something that can be taken like a piece of land. I'm here because I choose to be here." Archer closed his eyes, letting himself rest just for a heartbeat, for the first time since Silas arrived. As they stood there, night slowly draped itself over Hartwell Ridge, deep and quiet, like the end of a half-finished song. Eliza looked toward the dirt road leading into Wind Creek. Part of her knew Caleb could truly be on his way, and another part understood that their story had never promised perfect peace. But strangely, she felt calmer than she had in days, maybe because she finally knew she wasn't walking alone. She turned to Archer, her voice soft but certain like the sound of fire settling in a stove. "We'll find a way. Whether it's through the law or facing your family or simply proving that Hartwell Ridge isn't abandoned anymore. It's our home now." Archer opened his eyes and looked at her with a depth she knew she'd remember her entire life, the look of a man learning to place hope in something bigger than his old hurt. "Eliza," he whispered, "thank you." She smiled small, steady. "We built the roof. Now we hold on to it." The night wind swept through, carrying the cold breath of a changing season. Hartwell Ridge stood firm, beautiful in its imperfection, alive, and holding two people who leaned on each other to stay upright. And in that fragile stillness, the story's biggest question finally began to take shape. Would the love that had only just taken root be strong enough to stand against the storm, riding back from the past? As night dew settled on the new barn roof, Eliza felt something with absolute clarity. The challenge ahead wasn't just keeping the land. It was protecting the future they had only just begun to dream. Out on the wind-carved frontier, the story of Eliza Morrow and Archer Hartwell reminds us of a simple, enduring truth: people can break, but kindness doesn't run out. Eliza arrived in the West, carrying a scar everyone could see, and a pain no one could. Archer carried the quiet burdens of a childhood spent in the shadows. Both believed they had nothing left to trust, nothing worth holding on to. Yet, in the most fragile moment of their lives, they found each other, not to be saved, but to be seen. To be reminded that every person deserves a place where their heart can come home. Their journey offers a gentle lesson for all of us. Sometimes the best things in life don't come from where we're looking. They come from the broken detours, the doors that slammed shut, the losses that forced us onto unfamiliar paths. Those are the very roads that shape us into kinder, stronger versions of ourselves and help us recognize our own worth again. So, if you've ever been hurt, if you've ever felt like you no longer had a place to return to, remember this: you can begin again. All it takes is one offered hand, one warm light glowing behind a doorway, or just the courage to take one more step forward. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched you in any way, please like, share, and subscribe, so we can continue bringing you more tales of healing, hope, and quiet humanity. We'll see you again on the next journey.